and tell us as much as you can about where you were born, when you were born, any circumstances that would be of interest to the people that are going to see this film someday.
Okay, rather interesting. I was almost born in the huckleberry patch in the mountains, north from a little place called Wanksville in Adams County. My mother was pregnant, and perhaps she shouldn't have gone huckleberry picking that time, because when she was out in the huckleberry patch in the mountains near her home, and her home was close to a big mountain, she felt that she was having possible movements of giving birth, so she rushed back home, and I was born before the doctor could get there. I don't know if they had a telephone then, but how they managed, whether from the neighbors, whatever. But my mother was 18 years old when I was born, and she was 19 the month after I was born. I was born the 11th of July, 1922. And my father never married my mother. He, as I understand, gave my mom $200, and he said, let's forget the whole deal. He says, I'm not sure I'm even the little boy's daddy. My mother says, I wasn't with anybody else. You are the only one. But anyway, I never lived a day of my life with my real father, who was Aaron Samuel Kuhn. And he lived just a few miles from where I was born, with where my grandparents were. My mother lived with my grandparents. And she was working for a farm family that had a threshing machine business, and they raised steers, and that was Mr. Funt. And my mother was housekeeping for them and doing work there. And when I was just about 2 years old, my stepfather, Martin Luther Heller, decided to marry my mom, and that was about 1924. And he was better to me than many kids' real fathers were. I was an only child, and they never had any children together. So I was very fortunate to have Martin Luther Heller as my stepfather. And he never went beyond 5th grade, I understand. He was from a poor family. Ambrose Heller was his father, and Ambrose was a local sort of a police officer out in the country, and he used to wear a badge, and he would have billy clubs and handcuffs. I remember that, and he would help to guard the security at the election time at the polls. He would be there. That was one of his jobs. But anyway, Ambrose Heller was my step-grandfather, and he was a pretty nice fellow. When I was a kid, I remember they used to have a big piece of canvas, and they would put wheat bundles on this canvas, and they would beat the wheat with a flail as a manual threshing machine, so to speak. That's one of my memories from being at my step-grandfather's place. But anyway, getting back to my biological grandfather, my mother's parents, she was one of 17 children, and Harvey Beamer and his wife had 17 children, and my mother was one of those 17 children. And right now, all of the children are dead except 2 of my aunts. One is Aunt Hazel, who lives near Gettysburg, and she's about 2 years older than I am. She would be about 82 this year. And my other aunt would be about 90 years old now, and, and she is living in Bendersville, Pennsylvania. Aunt Elsie, and they're both wonderful aunts. They're the only two that I have. All the uncles are dead, and all the aunts, my mother's sisters, are dead except those two. So anyway, my stepfather eventually became a plumber, and that was the business that he had until he died in 1965, I guess it was. And he was very kind to me. When I was in high school, he built a little building about 8 by 10 feet, and that was became my bicycle shop eventually. Originally, I raised little chickens, sort of unusual chickens with feathers down on their feet. I forget what the brand was, but anyway, eventually we sold the chickens, and I started fixing bicycles.
Chickens?
Yeah, like Bantams. And that was my business experience when I was in high school. And then World War II came along, and I took my new merchandise into Gettysburg and sold it to a store that sold bicycle parts. Then I was in the military.
Let me ask you a question. Your parents, what kind of values did they instill in you that, as you grew up, that developed the person that you are today?
Being honest and truthful. Honest and truthful and obedient. My life was an easy life. I seldom got lickings because I tried to behave myself. I think only once do I remember physical punishment by my stepfather, and this is sort of an interesting little story. When I was a youngster, we went to visit my grandparents one Sunday afternoon, and my mother and my stepfather were having some kind of a disagreement, and to voice his authority, he told me when we started to go to my grandparents that I wasn't to get in the swimming pool, which was a homemade pond that my grandfather had made. And anyway, when we got to grandparents, eventually most of my cousins were in the pond swimming, and I was standing on the bank watching because I remembered my stepfather, Martin Luther Heller, says that I shouldn't get in the pond. Your raspberry iced tea is very good, Daniel.
Yeah.
Anyway, what other browsing would you like me to do?
Well, what's the earliest recollection you have as a child growing up? You go way back.
The earliest I can recall is one Saturday night when the three of us in my family used to go to Bendersville, which was just about a mile away. We grew up, we lived right outside of Bendersville. And Saturday nights was the time to go into town, and there was a restaurant there. And I can remember my mother sitting in a rocking chair, I guess it was, and I was small enough that I was in her lap and I would fall asleep in her lap. That's about as far back as I can remember. In this little restaurant right on the square in Bendersville. Now that restaurant is no longer there, it's a bank. Mm-hmm. They tore the restaurant building down and put a bank there. But that's about as far back as I can remember. I guess I was maybe 2, 3, 4 years old then. But I can't remember much beyond that. As yeah, I guess 2, 3, 4 years old. I can remember being at this farm family where my mother used to work, where she was working about the time my stepfather married my mother. And that was with a Harry Fun family, and I remember they had a piano, and I used to take one finger and pick out melodies on this piano. And I guess that's how I learned to eventually play the piano and the pedal organ, because there was always one available. And my grandfather, my mother's father, always had an old piano. So I would go there, and I enjoyed picking out melodies. And while we're talking about music, I told you this before, I guess. It seems as though most of those 17 aunts and uncles from my mother's family could play the harmonica. And when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, somewhere along there, I remember getting perhaps my first mouth organ. And at those times, you could buy a fairly good mouth organ for $1. And now the good Kuhn harmonicas cost $20 to $30 a piece. How the values of things changed. But anyway, and my uncle, my mother's brother, had an old beat-up guitar, and he knew I was interested in learning to play the guitar when I was in grade school. And he eventually sold it to me for 75 cents. And I think I had to spend $1.25, $1.50 to get a new set of strings to put on it. But as badly as that thing was warped, I learned to play the guitar. And I've never lost interest in the guitar or the piano or the harmonica.
As either a youngster or a teenager, what do you think was the most devilish thing that you ever did, whether it was a practical joke or I mean, some kids they steal watermelons.
You can stop right there. Stealing watermelons was perhaps the most devilish thing I can recall. I guess it was one Sunday afternoon. Some of the teenage fellows who had automobiles decided we were going to go eat watermelons. And I didn't know we had to steal them. But anyway, eventually I found myself in a cornfield where they had watermelons growing. And this field was owned by a friend of my stepfather, I learned later. But anyway, we were in this cornfield where the watermelons were, and we were picking out watermelons that looked ripe, and lo and behold, we heard the owner of the farm discovered us, and he says, "You thieves, I'm going to get you." And one of my good friends my age was Earl Warner, and he lived just a short distance from where I grew up, near Bendersville. And he started running, and I says, "Earl," I says, "stop." I says, "We're not going to run." And he says, "They'll catch us." And I says, "That's exactly what I want to happen." I says, "We shouldn't have been here stealing his watermelons in the first place." So I said, "Let's just stay right here, and when he sees us and comes here, we'll take our medicine." And later I heard, he came and he chewed us out, and he gave us a lecture. You don't go in a man's watermelon patch stealing his watermelon. He says, "If you'd have come to my house and asked me," he says, "I'd give you a free watermelon. But he says, to have you come in here and steal them," and he says, "Look, your buddies, they ran out and dropped watermelons," and says, that's destructive. But anyway, I later learned that this farmer had talked to my stepfather and was telling me, he says, it made me happy to see these two kids who could have run away. They stopped and they took my scolding." And he says, that sort of was unusual. So you see the devilish thing that I did. That was working in the hands of the devil, stealing. And so that's a memory I have.
In school, what might have been one of the most delightful things that you would enjoy, whether it was academically or in athletics, could have been social things that you did?
Yeah, thank you. Two things. In my last 2 years in high school in Biglerville, I was in the commercial department, and I happened to have been handy with my fingers. Maybe it's picking out tunes on the piano helped me get nice limber fingers. But anyway, I became the fastest typist in my class, and I was fairly good in shorthand. And during the junior or senior year, our business teacher took a carload of us kids up to Sunbury, where there was a regional contest, and I came away with a little gold first place award because I had the best typing record. I wasn't that good in shorthand, but in this particular contest or competition, I scored the best in my group. And eventually, being fairly good in shorthand and pretty good in typing, when the World War II came along, and that happened in December 7th, 1941, and that was when I was in my senior class, and at the end of our school, my friend Dale Gerber and I went to Baltimore, worked building airplanes for Glenn Martin, and we enlisted in the service, and my typing and shorthand got me a job with the 301st Air Service Group that was getting ready to go to India. So I went with this group to India and was there during 1943, 44, 45 until the end of the war. So that was a nice experience.
When you were a child, you said you had chickens?
Yeah, little bannies.
Did you have any other pets?
Oh, we always had a cat and a little dog.
Any of those pets your favorite?
Yeah, I guess I took when I was 16 or 17, I was able to drive, and I liked to take the cat along with me. And I remember I went to a little place called Gardner's, I guess, between Gardner's and Mount Holly Springs, and I stopped to go to the store or something, and the cat, I must have had the window up, and the cat got out, and I couldn't find him, and we lost the cat. But we always had a little dog.
As you were growing up in Biglerville, a lot of people that you knew called you Doc.
Yeah.
How did you come about getting the name Doc?
That came from my aunts and uncles, I guess. I was always fascinated with climbing up on things, and I would fall down. And I broke my wrist one time and a collarbone another time, and they had to call the doctor. And the story I got was the doctor had to come and see me, and he says, "Hey, he's Doc's little boy." He says, "He's always getting himself broken." So the nickname stuck. And even to this day, some of my friends over there still call me Doc. But in high school, it was PJ, my two initials. My classmates called me PJ.
As growing up, and either in school or in the neighborhood, can you remember the first female that you were attracted to or might have had a crush on, whether it was maybe an older girl or maybe a girl your own age, but can you remember a time that there was somebody that turned your head a little bit?
Yes. When I was in high school, one of my classmates, Gladys, her father was a janitor in Biglerville High School, and Gladys and I liked each other, and we had dates together. We never had sex together. But anyway, she was a nice...
That was the right answer, by the way.
We never had sex together, and I'm glad I was able to restrain myself. I was able to drive. I had an old an old 31 Chevy Roadster. And this was my traveling car. But I guess Gladys Roth, R-O-T-H, was her name. And I liked her folks, her mother and dad, and her brother used to keep the high school clean, mopping and sweeping and so forth. But anyway, that's one of the earliest girlfriends I can remember having.
And in school, you certainly had to participate in some sports, in gym or intramural sports. What were your favorite things to participate in athletically?
I'm glad you asked that, Daniel. I was in the gymnastic team. I was a little guy, so I wasn't good in football and that sort of thing, but I was in the gymnastic team, and one of my crowning achievements was to be able to run forward and jump in the air and do a complete somersault without touching my hands and landing back on my feet. And some of my friends still remember that I was able to do that. And one of my friends is Dale Gerber, who lives over in Hanover. And he just remarked, I guess earlier this year when I went to his birthday party, that I was one of the guys that could do an aerial somersault. Anyway, that was my crowning achievement. And in the first year of high school, and high school was all 4 grades, 9, 10, 11, and 12. In the first year or two, I rode my bicycle 4 miles and 8/10 each way to get to school and get back home. And I think that was a blessing to be poor, because it was a good physical fitness thing to ride your bike 5 days a week, almost 10 miles, just to get to and from school. Anyway,
School's 12 years of our life, high school,
yes,
until we get through high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you went to college after the service.
Mm-hmm.
But in that 12 years in school, what one memory do you have that brings you the most joy? Participating in the play or a social event?
I have a few good memories. During the first 2 years, I was in vocational, and we used to make things out of wood. And I remember one time I made a little squill file, just a little block of wood with a nail coming up from the bottom, and you put on your desk and you put papers on there. And the thrill was to be able to stain and varnish this squill file so that it was attractive. And another thing I made was a tie rack, which I had in my bedroom for years. I wish I'd have kept it when I moved away and came back to Hershey. But anyway, those two things the first 2 years in high school. But then when I was a junior and senior, I was in the commercial department. And one of my thrills was to be the counter guy for selling candy and ice cream and things at noontime to the classmates. And that was a pleasant experience that I remember having in school. And I guess at one time I did get my guitar up on the stage and did a little playing of music in high school.
Was that like a talent show? Or?
Yeah, something like that. And also, mentioning a talent show, in Bendersville they had talent shows, and I won, I think, $10, and took that $10 and bought a bicycle. $10 bicycle.
What's the saddest memory that you had in those 12 years, whether it was in school or at home or in that time of your life?
I didn't have many sad experiences, but this is one thing I regret to this day. One of my friends was John Keller. He was the son of a musical family who lived way up on the side of the mountain. And he and one of the classmates, George, one noontime when we were out in the playground. We're having a tussle, and George was a stronger one. He got John down, and John was my friend. And instead of trying to pull George off, I was there clapping my hands instead of trying to separate them. And I guess that's one of the negative memories I have of being in grade school at those times. I could have helped my friend. They were both my friends, but having one friend beat up another friend, that was a bad memory. I didn't do anything to separate them.
Well, I've known you for over 30 years. Maybe closer to 40, since the first time we met was when I was in the 6th grade, and you had to administer a test to me. And you had the senior high special education folks, and I had to come to your room right after lunch, and there was 5 or 10 minutes before you got there that I was alone with this senior high special ed folks. And coming from the parochial school environment, which was very strict, and watching these folks behave in the room, I thought certainly in the next 5 minutes, if you weren't going to come and administer this test to me, they surely would eat me alive. And I also remember I didn't quite understand that it was merely a placement test. So I'm sure this test I tried the hardest on any test in my life, because I thought if I didn't get a good enough grade, I surely would have to stay in that room with those students, which my demise was going to be short and sweet. But having said that, in all those years, and I've gotten to know you, I have some insight that a long time ago, you made a conscious choice to be somewhat of a pacifist, a person that wasn't going to be quick to anger, a person that wasn't going to have a showing of violence, a person that wasn't going to yell and scream. How did you come about making that conscious decision?
That is still part of my makeup, Daniel. And I am thankful to the Lord that I grew up that way. I suppose we all have a choice in life when things happen around us, and we can learn from negative situations. I was always taken aback by people who would get angry and swear and talk nasty to each other. And I remember as a kid, I used to tell myself, when I grow up, I'm not going to be that way. And I think even to this day, the disappointment in seeing other persons being so negative and argumentative and in a fighting mood, that turned me off. And it wasn't that I was such a great Christian, because in my whole growing up years, when my parents were alive, my mother and my stepfather anyway, they would seldom be found inside the church building unless somebody was getting married or somebody died. They weren't church members. But I was thrilled that some of the people I knew were going to church. And when I was 12 and 13 years old, I would work summers at my neighbor's farm, and they were Lutherans, and they would take me along with them. And I suppose that was when I really got turned on to trying to be a half-decent person, because when I was about 12, I was baptized into the Lutheran Church. And later, my family, we actually were Methodists, as far as I know. My grandparents, they went to the Methodist church when they went to church. But as a teenager, one time, when I was in high school, I heard that from the Methodist church that there was a training course in Gettysburg to teach young people how to become Sunday school teachers. And I remember raising my hand and saying, I think I'd like that. So I went to Gettysburg. That time I was a teenager and I was driving, and I don't know how many weeks this course lasts, but I remember taking that, and eventually I ended up teaching fourth graders in the Methodist church in Bendersville. There were only two churches. It's a little town. There was one Methodist church on one hill, and the other side of town there was a Lutheran church on a higher hill. But anyway, that was a good formative experience in my growing up, having taken that leadership course in Gettysburg and teaching youngsters in fourth grade. Barry Cluck was one of my students, and he was the grandson of the people who owned the restaurant in Bendersville. It was Booker's and Cluck's. Those two families were business families. Anyway,
in high school, or before high school, would you say that you had a best friend? Did anybody from Biglerville?
Dale Gerber, during high school years.
Yes, or before.
Dale Gerber, George Slusser, the boy who was fighting in the grade school and out in the recess time, and John Keller Schaefer. Those three, I suppose, I would consider some of my best friends, other than my relatives. But none of those were relatives, but they were good friends. John Keller Schaefer, whose family was musical. His father played the violin on Sunday afternoons. He had a sister that played the banjo, and another one that played the guitar, and one of them played the piano. And on Sunday afternoons, there was quite a gathering, local people who would go there to hear the music. And of course, one of the attractions for the people to come to hear the music was Mr. Schaefer made the barrels of cider down in his basement. And of course, the guys would come, and Mr. Schaefer would share his hard cider with the guys, and they would be pretty relaxed with the hard cider. But anyway, Mr. Schaefer and his children were making music, and I guess that's how I really got thrilled with music. But anyway, their son, John Keller, was one of my friends, and George Slusser, who was an adopted child, I guess, of a World War I veteran who was partly crippled. I think he was gassed with mustard gas, and he lived near the elementary school, which was called West Point Grade School. I don't know how they called it West Point, because West Point, of course, is the military academy up in New York. But anyway, George's stepdad was one of the first people to have a radio way back then, and that was before electricity was in the community. They were battery radios. I remember we would often go to George's parents' house and listen to the radio. And that's way back in the years when Amos and Andy were famous in the radio program. That's long before we had television.
Outside of school, what person, and this would be a non-teacher away from school, and this could be a person either that is a minister, it could be a parent, it could be a friend, it could be an uncle. From the time you were born until the time you left to go to the service, which means that time that you were in at home.
People had an influence on me?
The person that you feel had the most influence on your life.
One of them was Paul Crumb's father. Paul Crumb was just a few years older than I, but his dad had a jewelry shop, and his dad cut hair, and I think he cleaned people's guns and that sort of thing. But his house was just a few houses away from the Methodist church. And during the Depression years, I remember we were so poor that my stepfather, Martin Luther Heller, would say, Doc, would you go ask Henry Crumb, if he'd lend us $5? And I would go in and tell Mr. Crumb my dad wanted to borrow $5. And of course, we always told him when my dad gets his job back, or when he goes to work, he'll pay you. Anyway, Mr. Crumb was very helpful in lending money to my folks when we were down and out. I remember one time we were so broke, and this was just when I was a kid, that my stepfather, Martin Luther Heller, was out shoveling the garden. That was in the spring, to plant vegetables, and I don't know how the Lord provided this, but a 10-cent piece rolled off that shovel. And my stepfather, and Martin Luther Heller's nickname was Mushy. I don't know how he got the name Mushy, but they called him Mushy. Anyway, I never called him Mushy. And anyway, he took this 10-cent piece and he says, that'll buy us a loaf of bread. Would you go down to the store in town and buy a loaf of bread? And at that time, you could buy a big loaf of bread for 8 cents. And you could buy 2 little loaves of bread for a nickel. There was a bakery in Mount Holly Springs, I think, that made bread, little tiny loaves for a nickel a loaf. But I remember that illustration when this 10-cent piece rolled off his shovel. Now, whether he had it in his pocket and he just dropped it to let me believe it came out of the ground, I don't know. But as far as I know, it actually came out of the ground in the garden beside our house. That was a thrilling experience. I've never forgotten that. And one time, my stepfather, Martin Luther Heller, Mushy is his nickname, he wanted to improve our outhouse. So instead of having a one-pot outhouse, he wanted to build an outhouse with 2 seats. And he says, I'll tell you what I'll do. He says, if you dig the hole, I'll give you a little bit of money for digging the hole. And I remember I dug most of the hole for that outhouse. And I guess the hole might have been the size of this coffee table. And I don't know what it was, but it was 50 cents to a couple dollars, I think I got it. And that always turned me on, how I dug the hole for the 2-seat outhouse. And Poppy, we called him Poppy. Poppy paid me for digging that hole. And I was just I wasn't out of high school yet. I don't know just what year it was, but I remember that outhouse was still there when we sold the property after my parents died.
So you never had indoor plumbing
Eventually we did.
while you were home?
Yeah, well, I was going to college. I actually paid for, I had saved several $1,000s during the 3 years, 3 months, and 16 days when I was in service. And since my stepfather was a plumber, I said, I'll help to pay for some of the cost of the fixtures. He had been discussing a bathroom, so I actually helped to pay for some of the costs of the equipment. And we had 3 bedrooms upstairs in that little house. So they took the half of the middle bedroom upstairs, and that became our bathroom. And I can remember when I was a kid, we didn't have electricity. Electricity came in the late 30s, I guess. And they finally got out in the country with that. And I remember that we had outhouses. But anyway, eventually we had indoors. And I remember when my mother didn't even have since there was no electricity, there wasn't an electric washer to wash clothes. And I can remember when she had to wash clothes with a big tub of water and the wash rubber, I guess they called them, the corrugated thing, and how hard women had to work to keep clothes clean.
If I told you I had a time machine and I could send you back in time for 24 hours for one day, and what I wanted you to do before you left for the service, going on back from the first time you can remember, if you could go back and enjoy one day, what day might that be? What day would you like to go back and relive?
That's interesting. I haven't thought about this for ages. But there used to be vagrants, bums, people who had no home, they were broke, and bums got their name, I guess, because they would bum food from people. And this is the background that made me love my stepfather. I remember there were occasionally tramps, bums, vagrants. They called them tramps, they called them bums. I hear the word vagrant then. But anyway.
Transients.
Yeah, well, they didn't, it was either bums or tramps. But anyway, Mushy Heller, Poppy Heller, would seldom ever turn away a hungry tramp or a bum when he came to our house. I can remember there was, as poor as we were, there was always bread or something that we would give this bum. And Harvey Hershey, my father-in-law, your wife's grandfather, I understand was the same way. Tramps would come to the house, they were hungry and they didn't have any place to sleep at night, and he would say, "We'll feed you, we'll let you sleep in the barn, but you'll have to give me your matches and your cigarettes. We don't have you be smoking up there and burn the barn down." So both your mother-in-law's people, Mary Ann's folks, were that way, and my stepfather, Mushy, Poppy Heller, was the same way. Those are beautiful experiences. And you said if I could have a 24-hour period, I would want to include one of those times when Poppy Heller showed compassion to people. It's a little thing, but it's part of me. They tell me you have a choice, Daniel. You can see the good in people, you can see the bad in people. You can harp on the bad and forget about the good that people do. And my philosophy has always been, if we spend more time giving credit to people for the good things they do, rather than dwell upon their failures, and all of us, except Christ, have had our weak moments. I think the world and we people in it would be much better off. Accentuating the positive, eliminating the negative, and don't mess with anything in between. That's the whole quote. I sincerely believe that would be...
And I would agree with that. What would you do to the person that came and kicked you in the shins 3 times a day, at breakfast and at lunch and at dinner, without fail?
Well, I suppose if I couldn't get away from it, I would have to ask, why are you doing this? What have I done?
They don't want to talk about it.
I guess I would still be insistent, because I like to discuss things.
They don't never want to talk about it.
I certainly wouldn't want to retaliate the same way. I would try to get out of the way of that person. I'd try to discover why that person felt that he had to kick me in the shins. But
would you recommend that we talk about how well they kick?
Oh, I guess you could do that. Are you asking this because you know of someone who did this?
I think it's a philosophy.
Well, I haven't heard that particular.
And although the
kicking in the shins.
Although maybe someone doesn't physically kick you in the shins, maybe they abuse you or demean you, or take every opportunity to never take your side.
Oh, well.
And when you find someone, I know this isn't my interview, but when you find someone who continually will insist to kick you in the shins, and then when they're questioned, and someone points out to them how it wasn't deserving, the person didn't deserve to be kicked in the shins, and they say, I know. And they say, well, why do you do that? And they say, I don't know. Then my advice to you would be maybe not searching for the good in them, accepting them for what they are, knowing that they're going to come kick you in the shins, and try to your best ability stay out of their way.
If I couldn't stay out of that person's way, I think if
Well, we can all stay out of somebody's way, no matter who they are. We can stay out of the way of the people who want to purposely hurt us, and it's better for all people concerned.
but if it were a relative or a friend of a relative, or I think I would still want to try to reach that person who felt so negative, and I'd try to persuade him to be more compassionate, to be more loving, to be more kind.
Oh, maybe in 6 weeks, or maybe within a 6-month period, or perhaps even in a year period, or maybe even during a 2-year or 3-year or even a 5-year period. You may want to have negotiations. But after 35 years, I think it's time to accept. Acceptance in all people's, they have to accept exactly what the situation is and realize it's never going to change and modify. There's only one person you can modify, and that's yourself.
Yes, yes.
And when the other person is not going to ever be modified, when they are never going to be able to bring that thing under control, that they will continue to behave in that same way. And when it's pointed out to them, they go, I don't know why I do that. Then you, I think, are obligated to modify and make sure that those circumstances are non-existent. And sometimes distance and as little conversation as possible will limit that to such a small amount that nobody, they'll forget that it exists. They won't even notice. But that's what has to be done sometimes. Anyway.
Well, I was wondering, as you were saying this,
Of course, you and I both know what we're talking about, don't we, Paul?
well, you may have a particular person in mind.
You may have a particular person in mind.
And I would enjoy exploring the matter further.
Well, I will bring this point to you.
If I'm guilty of...
You've done this a long time ago. You have modified your behavior a long time ago.
Well, now you got me guessing.
It's kind of interesting how we do things. I would say, hypothetically speaking, that if someone was to impose their will upon Paul Kuhn, imposing their will, first of all, would result in what I would call passive aggression. And passive aggression, to me, is when someone tries to oppose their will on Paul, he will never let on that he has just gone into stubborn mode. He'll never let that on. He won't have a discussion about it. But after they impose and tell him the things that they want him to do, from a list from 1 to 10, Paul, history proves me right, has his own agenda, and he first satisfies his agenda, and the other things will have to wait. And as an example, if someone objected to you going to a watch collector's meeting,
Okay.
and they protested very heavily during the course of a meal, hypothetically, if this
Okay.
ever happened. I know it did never happen. We'll just use this as an example because we know it never happened. On that very night, he would agree, he would hear the other person out, he would be mannerly, he would never raise his voice, but after supper, he'd jump right in the car and attend that watch collector's meeting.
Yes, yes.
Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong.
That's what I call modified behavior.
Yes, you're right. You're right.
That's not the way you would prefer to do it.
Right, I agree.
You would prefer harmony through the meal
Yep, yep.
because you're going to the watch collector's meeting anyway.
That's right. That's right. I am guilty of having been that way. If I felt the watch collectors meeting, and I was the president of the headquarters unit down in Columbia of the National Association of Watch Collectors for 1 year, and I was very thrilled to be associated with them. Of course, I attended meetings when other people were the president, but we used to go to these various displays, and we would have our our meeting at different places, so we'd excite people into learning more about watches. But anyway, you're right. I philosophically would be that sort of person. If I felt the watch collectors meeting was important enough after the meal, I would take off and go to the watch collectors meeting. I wouldn't necessarily make everybody happy who didn't want me to go to the watch collectors meeting.
Just a piece of philosophy we're going to throw in here.
Yeah.
Now, trying to stay on course, and we're talking about your experience as a youth, and we talked about you being in the watermelon patch, and we talked about some of your best friends. We talked about people that would influence your life outside of school. And in high school or elementary school, can you think of a person, a teacher, who influenced your life, and how they influenced your life?
Yeah. Carrie Slayball. She was Carrie Peters. Her maiden name was Peters, and she lived in the one end, the farthest end of Bendersville from where I lived. She lived right in the edge of town, but she was my grade school teacher for a number of years, and she used to have a little automobile. I guess it was back in the 30s. Well, it had to be because that's the time I was in the grade school. And she would drive from Bendersville up to this little West Point grade school, and she would offer to pick me up. I would walk the mile or two to school. But anyway, eventually after my mother died, and after her husband died, they never had any children, she became a sort of a girlfriend of my stepfather, almost until the year he died in 1965, I guess. And it's rather interesting. After I came back from India and Burma, and under the GI Bill, I started to Shippensburg College. It was this very same lady who had been my grade school teacher, and she hadn't yet become my stepfather's girlfriend. She wanted to go back to college and add to her training, because in those years you could become a school teacher with just 2 years of college, and that was the Shippensburg Normal School. And she went along with me. I drove from Bendersville, where I lived, over the mountains to Shippensburg, and for 1 year she went along with me to school. And I remember having sat in a music class with my previous grade school teacher, Carrie Peter Slaybaugh, and that was a thrill. So she was my grade school teacher. She went with me to college to increase her background training, and she eventually became my stepfather's girlfriend after my mother died. Rather interesting how it turned out that way. But she was a fine teacher.
When you were a child or a young adult, and I realized you lived through the Depression and you saw some hard times. You're not the type of person to complain about the hard times, anything that you've lived through, and you look back and you survived it. You felt that you grew through that experience.
Those experiences made us appreciate what we have today.
Sure. But in those times, was there a vacation, a birthday, a wedding, some event that you remember and it was one of the hallmark events of your life?
That's interesting. That's interesting. I can remember my stepfather's brother, Harry Heller, and his nickname was Boots Heller. And he used to come visit us quite often. He was one of my favorite step-uncles. And I don't know whether it was the hard cider, but he used to get all excited. He says, "It's coming on me, it's coming on me." And whether he felt a little intoxicated or whatever it was, and he used to run from our house up into part of the mountain. We had our house was at the bottom of a mountain, and I remember he used to run up and down where we had a cleared area there where we planted vegetables and corn and so forth. And he used to say, "It's coming on me, it's coming on me," and he used to run up and down the side of that mountain with that short distance, maybe a couple hundred feet. But this was Boots Heller. And then when I guess either my later grade school years, grade school was grades 1 to 8, and either near the when I was 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, I guess, somewhere along there, Boots had a trap line, and he would have traps out along the little stream where he lived to catch muskrats. And I remember he used to say, "Doc, if you want to help me go check my traps in the morning," he says, "I'll share some of the money that I get for selling the skins." And I remember getting up early in the morning and walking the trap line and seeing if there was any muskrats that were caught in his traps. And this was rather a treat in my background. I thrilled at those things. And in 1942, after I graduated from high school, my friend Dale Gerber and I went down to Glenn L. Martin's aircraft for a couple months, and we were building airplanes. And I remember meeting a nice girl there in Baltimore, near where I was living in an apartment. And one time Boots offered to let me borrow his Chevy. I think it was a 1936 or 37, something like that. But it was a nice looking Chevy, and I remember he let me borrow that, and I had a date with this girl, Doris Crouch, in Baltimore, at the edge of Baltimore, a little place called Essex, between Baltimore and Glenn L. Martin Airplane Factory. But I remember having Boots lend me his nice Chevy, because he trusted me and I took good care of him. And that was a nice experience.
Do you remember the first girl you ever kissed?
Offhand, no. Offhand, no.
Wasn't too memorable a kiss, I take it.
It wasn't mushy kisses like they do in the movies where you open your mouth and you stick the tongue down in the back of the other person's mouth. No, that didn't, that never turned me on.
Most people have known you in the last 40 years, like I basically have known you, would all agree that somewhere along the line, they've witnessed you jotting things down in little notebooks.
Oh, Daniel, you got me.
Now my question is,
It's one of them,
somewhere along the line,
another one of them.
perhaps it was before the service, you must have, I would guess, and I don't know the story, but I would guess someone impressed you because they were great note takers and they recorded things, and you saw this behavior and you said, you know what, this is something I am going to be, it's going to be part of me so I don't forget things, and I'm going to start writing them down and keep records. So my question to you is, was there a person that you modeled after somewhat in this record keeping, who that person was, and when did you start the record keeping?
I suppose, to give him due credit, my commercial teacher. He was a marvelous person, and he taught me my shorthand. He encouraged me in typing, and if I remember correctly, he used to write with his left hand, and that sort of inspired me because my mother told me that she believed I was born left-handed, and when I would try to use my left hand, she would slap my hand because she says people had told her that it's bad luck to have a kid who's left-handed. But anyway, this business ed teacher was constantly writing with his left hand, and I don't know if I got my note taken from him, but when it first started, I don't know. But being a stenographer in the military, going to the leadership Sunday school training course in Gettysburg, I sort of grew up with keeping records. I kept diaries for ages and ages. I still try to
How
keep.
young were you when you kept your first diary?
They weren't diaries as you go out to the store and buy a diary now. Usually notebooks.
Yeah.
And nowadays, it's an 8 by 10.5 loose leaf notebook that I have by my desk upstairs. And I try to do a page every day, 8.5 by 11. 8.5 by 11. And of course, as I'm traveling around, I have my pocket calendar and my little 3 by 5 notebook, and I'm constantly writing people's names and phone numbers in those. But for some reason, Dan, even when I go to Sunday school and church, I have a spiral notebook, and I still take notes. And sometimes just to make sure I didn't forget all of my shorthand, sometimes I will try to take some of the sermon in shorthand, just to keep me from getting completely rusty and losing everything that I had.
Where do you suppose that first notebook that you kept might be today?
Oh, that's a good question.
Do you think it survived the years?
Some of the early ones maybe are up in our attic, because we have lard cans, like the size of a 5-gallon bucket, and some of our old papers are kept in those lard cans. Some of my letters, the letters that my mother used to send me, I tried to keep letters that I sent from India back to her. We keep that sort of thing. That's a good question, but I'll have to think about that when I first really started keeping notes. But I guess it's part of my business training, shorthand and typing. And of course, it's been a thrill to always try to become as nearly accurate as you can in the use of the language. And I suppose that's one of the reasons for my writing. It's a good question. It's a good question.
To your best recollection, and you want to think about this for a second, in those years, what was the saddest thing that ever happened in your life from before you left from the service, growing up? Thing that you look back on and you'd have to say this was maybe a low point in my life?
Well, now it's interesting that you ask that. I don't usually feel remorse about a lot of things. When my mother died and Poppy died, some of my relatives died, people would ask me after the funeral service, why weren't you bawling? Why weren't you crying? I said, because I was thinking of the positive things that came from that person during the lifetime that I knew that person. And I think that takes the grief away. I thought of when my stepfather died, I thought of the nice things that down through the years he and I exchanged, and the example he set, and with my mother the same way. So
that's a good attribute, and I think if people can take a negative thing and change it into something positive,
yeah.
But surely in your life, before you went to the service, there had to be a time that you can recall, which was a low point, some sadness. Everyone has some sadness. We can't always turn lemons into lemonade.
Good expression. Good expression. I at the moment, without delving back into it, I can't think of anything that was tragically sorrowful for me. My life has been filled with good experiences. The people I've met are more important than things. Although, as you know, I like to collect clocks and watches and books. But in the final analysis, people are the most valuable assets we have. And learning to understand them, be compassionate with them, and where we can to be helpful, I suppose dwelling on those things sort of takes the edge off of any situation that might be sorrowful or hurtful. Or, I can't think of any sorrowful situations. Like I say, stealing watermelons and watching my one friend beat up another friend in grade school. Those are little things that...
You lost your cat?
Yeah, I lost my cat because I took him along, and while I was stopping for ice cream or something, he got out of the car and got lost.
I mean, sometimes children, as I was growing up, the big thing was children got ducks and they got these colored chickens, and you hear stories occasionally, the children, they'll, before they go to bed, they'll sneak a duck or a chicken out of its little box where it's not supposed to leave, and they'll take it to bed with them, and inadvertently during the evening they roll over on it and they
kill it.
And they kill it, and that's a low moment. They feel real bad that happened.
That brings two situations. Now this isn't horrible or horrendous, but I remember one time when I was just a little guy, before my folks bought the house in Bennettsville where I spent most of my life, they rented a little place nearby, and I remember it was built on the side of a bank, side of a mountain. And anyway, there was a front porch that there was a railing, and down below was maybe 10, 15 feet, the basement, ground level. And I remember there was a little pet duck that we had, and I was playing with this duck on the front porch where this railing was in that distance down there, and I guess he must have grabbed me by the finger and I got angry with him, and I pushed him out under the railing, and he fell down and broke his neck, and I got scolded for that. And another time, living in that same household where we rented before my folks bought their first house, I was playing with a cat, and I guess the cat scratched me, and I thought, well, I'll fix you, I'll pan you up. And there was a cook stove in the house, and there was no fire in it at the time. So I opened the oven door and stuck the cat in there and shut the door, and I forgot about the cat. And along came mealtime, my mother made a fire to cook the meal, and she heard the scratching in there, and lo and behold, it was getting hot and the cat wanted out. So she opened the door and discovered that the cat could have been burned to death if she wouldn't have discovered it. But anyway, those were sort of humorous things. I was a naughty little boy. And along about another incident, living in that same house, and I'll come closer, you can see it. Right here in my left eye, there's a scar. There's a scar right here.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see it.
Get down a little further. Get down a little further. Keep going down. Keep going. Right there. Yep.
There's a scar right there.
Yep.
And that comes from my having had a block of wood and a paring knife of some kind, and I was trying to shave little chips off of this block of wood, and I hadn't learned the safety rule that you don't cut toward yourself. And apparently I got through the chip, and the knife, I had all this force behind it, and the knife could have made me blind in that left eye. But fortunately, it was just down below the eye, and I never suffered any injury. And I remember Poppy, my stepfather, Mushy Heller, took a piece of paper bag that loaves of bread came in, tore a little piece off and stuck it on top of that cut to keep the blood from flowing out of there. And that was a little incident. I remember when I was just little, I mustn't have been more than 3, 4 years old. But I remember those 3 incidents when we lived in that house. Pushing the duck out under the railing, and he fell down and broke his neck, and putting the cat in the oven to punish him, and then my mother making the fire and the cat scratching to get out, and then my carving this piece of wood and almost cutting my left eye out.
What was your most favorite meal? Something that either when you went out to a restaurant, perhaps, or you went to a family reunion, or at home, but when they sat down and they told you that there was a certain thing going to be served, I mean, you were ready.
Oh, I guess nowadays, Dan.
No, I'm talking about when you were.
Oh, when I was a kid.
Well, up until the time you left for the service, we're kind of going to stick to that here
Okay.
for a while.
All right. Going back to my grandparents' time, grandfather, that's my mother's parents. With those 17 children, it was quite a challenge for Harvey Beamer to feed all these kids, and their house was on the edge of a mountain, and in that mountain there were a lot of deer. And he and his older boys were very good with the rifle and catching some of these deer. And I don't have any way of proving this, but I believe the game wardens knew the situation and knew that with 17 children, nature would provide some of the food to feed these kids. And I don't recall that my grandfather was ever arrested for shooting deer out of season, but whenever the family ran low on meat, there was almost always venison on the table. And I remember how delicious that venison was. Now, that's not going out to a restaurant and eating.
Oh no.
And
But that's something you remembered was a wonderful meal.
yes, that was a wonderful meal. And my grandmother would bake bread And my one uncle, who was about a year younger than he would be about 78 or 79 now, and I was about a year older than he. He and my mother would drop me off at my grandmother's very often, and I remember when we were little, Grandma would bake bread, and when the loaves would come out of the oven, one of our treats was to get the heel off of the loaf of bread and smother it with butter. That was that and the venison were the two greatest memories I have of food when I was a kid around my grandparents. And going back to the Depression days, my mother, we were so poor that she would take lard in the pan and sprinkle some flour in there and brown this flour. And we originally didn't have milk as a rule, we had canned milk. She would take water and pour in this brown flour, and that was done with her lard, and salt and pepper, and that was wonderful on bread. And we didn't have electric toasters then, it was before the electric came. And my mother used to bake bread. And anyway, I remember we would toast a slice of bread on the top of the cook stove. That's how we had toast. No electricity, no electric toasters, and you made your own toast. But anyway, breaking up this toasted bread came from the top of the cook stove with this homemade gravy without any meat in it, just lard and flour browned together with water. Of course, in later years, my stepfather, Mushy and Martin Heller, would get a deer, then she could chop up the chunks of venison. But we never starved. Even homemade gravy without meat and without milk even, we survived. It would keep you alive.
You spoke about your grandfather, Heller.
Yes.
And
that was my stepfather's father. My stepfather was Martin Luther Heller.
Yes.
But my other grandfather was the Beamer, Harvey Beamer.
And Beamer. And I don't recall which. And you mentioned that
I love them both.
They didn't go to jail for killing the
Deer
deer
out
out
of
of season. However, they also did something else that was a little illegal at the time. You might recall.
Now you learn more about me than I thought you knew.
Perhaps I listen instead of talk. That's how you learn things along the way.
Oh. Yeah. My grandfather, my mother's father, in order to support these 17 children. That's right, he was a bootlegger. Is that what you had in mind?
Oh, yeah.
A bootlegger. And I understand he had one or two stills out in the mountain. I never saw the stills, but I know whiskey came from out in the mountains. But he did make beer, and I would see where the beer was in big 5-gallon crocks. And on a Sunday afternoon, a lot of the men in the area knew that they could get beer and whiskey from my grandfather. And how much he charged, I don't know. But I remember that.
How old were you?
That was before Franklin Roosevelt became president. Franklin Roosevelt, I think, was elected, I think they elected him in even years. 1932 was when he was elected, I think, 32, and 33, 34, 35, 36, I think that's the way it went. But anyway, it was before Franklin Roosevelt became president that we had prohibition, and people weren't supposed to, you couldn't get out and buy whiskey and beer. So my grandfather made it. And with the little income that he got from illegally making and selling beer and whiskey, he helped to feed these kids, 17 children. I don't know if that's what you had in mind.
That's what I had in mind.
And Poppy used to make beer just for himself. And of course, his brother at the Boots, the one that you run up and down the mountain and says, "It's coming on me, coming on me." I think he would drink some of that beer or hard cider, and he would feel he's getting intoxicated. But, oh my goodness, I didn't realize you remembered all these things, Daniel. I think I have to sneeze.
It's all right, we can quit for a couple seconds here.
Yeah, I didn't realize you were.
So how you feeling tonight?
Almost as well as I would like to.
Did you do anything interesting today?
Yes, I took your mother-in-law's picture of two women talking to each other along a wooden fence, and she entered it in the Pennsylvania Department of the Aging in Harrisburg, and I took the framed picture up and with a $5 fee entered her painting, and Marianne was very thrilled. She knew she had wanted to take it up there, but she was out babysitting, and I saw the picture there on the table, and I thought, well, she wants to take this up there, and she had found the address and the person in the Department of Aging that was to receive this picture. So I had some time this afternoon, and I got in my vehicle, and I took the picture up and turned it in to a lady named Michelle on the 5th floor on Walnut Street, across from the education building in Harrisburg. And so that made Marianne very happy. The lady says, does she want to sell it? And I says, well, she didn't mention, but I said, to keep it in the family, I would gladly give her $50 just as it is, so she wouldn't sell it. But I says, whether she wants to sell it or whether she wants to put a price on it, I don't know. So I told Marianne that when I got home from Harrisburg. And so it was sort of thrilling that somebody liked her picture and was even asking if she wants to sell it, what would she sell it for? But I called it Best Friends. Marianne might have another name for it, but anyway, it's a rather interesting picture. I wish I'd had a copy to bring along down and show you. But that was exciting.
Well, the last time we talked a lot about your earliest memories as a child and your time with Poppy. We talked about growing up in Biglerville,
Yes, I went to high school at Victorville.
and we talked about your high school friends. I think we talked a little bit about the fact that you fessed up to a farmer about stealing his watermelon.
Yes, yes. He said if we would have just come up to his house and asked him, he would have given us the watermelon. And I mentioned my friend Earl Warner was with me, and he started running, and I says, Earl, hold it. And he says, why? He'll catch us. And I says, that's exactly what we're going to let him do. I says, we shouldn't have been here in the first place. And our buddies took off, and they dropped their watermelons, and some of them and broke them. And so this farmer was a friend of my stepfather, and he later says, those two little guys stood there and took my tongue lashing, but he says it's to their credit that they didn't run away, and they realized that they shouldn't have been there in the first place, and they took my scolding. Yeah, that was something I like to remember. Not that I was stealing watermelons, but that we knew we were doing wrong, and we paid the penalty by being chewed out by my stepfather's friend. And that was over near Aaronsville, which is a little town close to Biglerville.
You're in high school. What year did you graduate, Paul?
1942.
1942.
June 42, and I went from there with my closest friend Dale Gerber down to Baltimore. We got a job with the Glen L. Martin aircraft company, and I was helping to build PBM-3 flying boats. And along came September, and we felt that the war was on, and women like Rosie the Riveter could be doing what we were doing. It was no complicated task, and we decided we would enlist in the Air Corps. And that's exactly what we did on the 14th of September, 1942. And I was pretty good at typing in shorthand, and they discovered in New Cumberland, where we enlisted, that there was an outfit in Michigan that was getting ready to go to India. And they promptly contacted that outfit, which was the 301st Air Service Group, and they, a few days later, sent me out to Michigan, and we promptly got ready to move, and they discovered out there that I never had basic training even. So they sent me out to the airport hangar and gave me several days of close order drill. It was a substitute for basic training. And then promptly our outfit was shipped to the forested area outside of Syracuse, New York, and there was another Air Corps outfit similar to ours, also encamped in the wooded area. That was a training prior to going overseas. And I think I may have mentioned before, in my opinion, that was one of the coldest winters I ever spent in my life, before or since then.
And that was where?
That was in the wooded area outside of Syracuse, New York. And then from there we went down towards Fort Dix, and on my birthday, on the 11th of July, I remember so vividly, we sailed near the Statue of Liberty on our way to India. And we went down to South America, Rio de Janeiro, where we refueled our ship, and then around South Africa and up into the Indian Ocean to Bombay. And from there we went by narrow gauge railroad up into northeast India near the Himalayan mountains. And then later we were shipped into Burma for a while. That's the first I saw Japanese prisoners in a small prison compound. But I fortunately never had to shoot at anybody. Nobody ever shot at me. And it was a nice experience for parts of 3 years. It was 1943 that we went over to India. I enlisted in 42, spent that winter up in Syracuse, New York, and then January came, and that was 43, and then by the 11th of July we were on our way and passed the Statue of Liberty on our way to India.
I know that we're going to back up a minute, and I know that it must have been difficult to graduate during a time when this country was at war. But what emotions did you have when you graduated high school? And I realize there was a war on, but not about the war, but how did you feel leaving Biglerville, leaving the high school? What kind of emotions ran through you at the time when you were going through the ceremony and you knew that it was over and you were going to move on with your life?
We had heard about this aircraft factory in Baltimore, and we felt that we could make a contribution helping to build airplanes.
I mean, how did you feel about leaving high school and letting all that behind?
Oh, we graduated. It was a good experience. I did well.
The caps and the gowns, and
Oh,
I'm
yes.
sure you had some kind of school prom or some kind of affair.
Yeah, that was all part of the process. I told you in previously chatting about it, but I had a little job over the lunch period selling candy and ice cream to the fellow students, and I was one of the student secretaries who occasionally worked in the office as a volunteer typist. So it was a good experience, and I'm very grateful for the little high school in Biglerville for the grooming that it did. I have no regrets.
How old were you when you had your first drink of alcohol?
If you include hard cider,
Well, the first time you drank alcohol and you realized that it was, not only did it taste bad, but it did give you an effect, some kind of a feel.
That's cute. I guess I'll have to include hard cider as alcohol. I guess hard cider is alcohol. Anyway, I think I mentioned in our previous chat that on a Sunday afternoon, many of the local people near Bendersville
Yeah.
would go up to John Schaefer's home in the mountains, and he had cider made in the fall, but putting it in a barrel and letting it age, it became hard cider.
How did you get your hands on
I didn't drink hard cider there, but one of my uncles who lived between Bendersville and Wanksville, where I was born, right outside of Wanksville, that uncle had hard cider in his basement, and one of his sons and I went down and we sampled his hard cider. So I guess that's the first I can recall imbibing in alcohol or things of that nature.
it? How old do you think you were at the time?
Oh, 8 or 10 years old, perhaps. Grade school age. Grade school age. It's just that we knew that the old folks, the grown-ups, drank this stuff, and we just wanted to see what it was like. And then one time at my grandfather's place, and I had mentioned before that my mother would often park me with my grandparents. That's my mother's parents. And my uncle Raymond, who was a year younger than I, he and I knew that grandfather kept some beer in a little spring at the edge of the woods where they lived. And I remember one time we went up there and I think we opened a bottle of his home brew. And there again, I think I was at grade school age. And I think I mentioned that that same uncle fell off his bicycle and injured his head, and in a few years he died. But that was those are the two times that I remember when I was a youngster that I tried hard cider. My grandfather did make beer before President Roosevelt came into office, and also my grandfather, my mother's dad, made whiskey up in the mountains. He had one or several stills. I never saw those, but I did see where he made beer around the house where he lived. But we may have touched a little bit of the beer, but it didn't become a habit. And my stepfather himself made home brew. I remember he used to get malt and sugar and yeast, I guess, and a big 5-gallon crock, and he would make beer. I guess it wasn't illegal for people to make their own. I don't know how the law did it. But anyway, it was Prohibition days before President Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into office. But he promptly changed things, and he felt that Prohibition should be thrown out and people should be allowed to drink a can of beer or a bottle of beer and have some wine. And of course, now you can go to many places and buy a bottle of beer or a case of beer. You can buy bottles of wine. There's no law against it. It's legitimate.
What family tradition, as an example, for several years I think the family has come to our home for Christmas Eve, and we make oyster stew and some different soups, and there's always a sub here, and there's music, and it's rather fastidious, and we I guess you would say after a number of years it's become a family tradition. As you were growing up in your family, whether it would be an uncle or an aunt or your parents or a good friend or neighbor, do you remember a tradition, something you did, for several years that you really liked, and either you still continue that tradition in your own family, or if you had a chance to do it again, you would have tried to continue that tradition?
As a youngster, I can't really recall any such gathering like you have here.
No, it doesn't have to be like the one we have here.
Yeah.
It could have been, you might have had a tradition where when the fall leaves came as a family, or in Sunday school, or you walked up a certain trail and you collected leaves. It could be in the summertime you went to a cabin somewhere. You lived near Laurel Lake, I think, wasn't
Yes.
too far off.
Yes.
But it's something that you had to do more than once, otherwise it wasn't a tradition, it was just what would just say a flash in the pan. There must have been something that you remember and fondly that you did and you really enjoyed.
Well, this wasn't really like a food gathering, but Mount Holly Springs had a sort of a super store, and I remember my folks and some of our friends would drive from Bendersville over to Mount Holly Springs to this supermarket, and that was for them a treat. And I mentioned before that that's a little thing, but on a Saturday night, my mother and my stepfather would go into Bendersville, and this was a treat to have banana splits. And of course it was, I guess, 3 dips of ice cream with bananas split on the side, and toppings of nuts and so forth. I can remember that as something that my parents enjoyed as a great treat.
So there is kind of a tradition that you have started some time ago, and I don't remember exactly when, but I think at a lot of family gatherings, you were willing to get your guitar out and play a few songs. And would you be willing to play a song for us now?
Yes. Up at our place, the Hershey family had an annual picnic. And that, I guess, would be in line with what you have in mind. And we would get out our instruments and play. I guess that's about as close as I can recollect to. Let's see if I can find a pick in here. Anyway. I know a funny little man, his name is Simon Slick. He had a mule with dreamy eyes, and how that mule could kick. He'd wink his eye and he'd wag his tail, and he'd greet you with a smile, then gently telegraph his leg and lift you half a mile. Whoa, you, whoa. Why don't you hear him holler? Tie a knot in the end of his tail, or he'll slip through his collar. Why don't you put him on a track? Why don't you let him go? And every time that mule starts off, say whoa, mule, whoa. This mule, he is a daisy. He'd pulverize a hog, dissected 7 Chinamen, and he mashed a yellow dog. He'd kick as quick as lightning. He has an iron jaw. He's just the thing to have around to tame Daniel's mother-in-law. Whoa, you, whoa. Why don't you hear him holler? Tie a knot in the end of his tail, or he'll slip through his collar. Why don't you put him on a track? Why don't you let him go? And every time that mule starts off, say whoa.
Very good.
For years, when we would visit my mother and my stepfather over in Adams County, well, at that time my mother had passed away. She died in 1949. But anyway, as your daughter and Dwight and the older sister Elizabeth were little youngsters, we used to travel over to Adams County and visit my stepfather. And usually on a Sunday afternoon. And on the way home, I would often sing this song, and I would stop short of the last two words, "Whoa, mule, whoa." And the kids used to say, and I guess your wife can remember that, it says, "Daddy, finish it, finish it." And I got a lot of fun out of just stopping the two words short. But anyway, this is typical of some of the old songs that I learned as a kid. As I mentioned before, in a one-room country school, we had a music teacher who lived in York Springs, and he used to bring his manually powered record player, and he had a guitar, and he taught us a lot of these old songs. And this very song that I just sang, I may have learned from that traveling music teacher. Grade school experience. First 8 grades in a little place between Bendersville and Wanksville called West Point. West Point Grade School.
I know we talked about when you went into the service, your intention was not to be a stenographer. Your intention, I believe, if I remember correctly, was to be possibly a radio operator or electronics person.
Yes, I had thoughts of that. I had been interested in ham radio. I had learned the Morse code, and it's still thrilling for me to see words and mentally spell them in the Morse code. The speaker up there says B-O-S-E.
Bose.
Yeah, da did it, da da da, did it. There's Bose in Morse code.
Mm-hmm.
And as I get older, I get concerned about how my memory seems to go to sleep. And my thought is that other than eating foods that supposedly are helpful with your memory, exercising what little memory we have left might be one avenue to pursue to retain some of our memory before we lose it all. So anyway, I do that, and sometimes even in church, I usually keep a notebook, and I will write some of the preacher's sermon in shorthand, just to make sure I don't forget all my shorthand. So I practice Morse code and shorthand even to this day. And just a couple weeks ago, I saw, in fact, it was last week, at the Fishburne rummage sale, they had a textbook on shorthand, and I told them that I guess I would be interested in acquiring it, and they says, "Paul Kuhn, since you've been playing music here for us for parts of 2 days, it's on the house." So they gave me that textbook on Greg's shorthand. And it's this sort of thing that makes life interesting to me. I don't know how many others in the area know shorthand at all, and I don't know how many others know Morse code or would be interested in learning it. But as a kid, we used to use flashlights, sending Morse codes with my friends and my relatives, kids my age, and we used to take a string and draw it around the corner of a house, and without seeing each other, we could send simple messages by pulling the string, sending messages with Morse code, flashlights, and by pulling strings. And we could even send messages by tapping with our fingers on a person's hand and sending simple messages. It's just a fun thing.
Were you disappointed at the fact that you weren't able to capitalize on the electronics, radio work?
Not really, because it was what I was doing was interesting. In India, when we got positioned, I was working under the guidance of the highest ranking sergeant in the whole outfit, and he was Master Sergeant Chester Arthur Hampshire from Mount Clemens, Michigan. And he was a marvelous old guy. It was a career for him, the military. He wasn't just called in because of World War II. It was his career. And he was a marvelous fellow to work for. And, I think I mentioned this before. Each month, each of the 12 squadrons in our air service group was required to submit a monthly historical report, and it was the job of the Master Sergeant to pick out the things from each of those 12 reports that he thought were significant, and it was my job to compile them into a report that eventually was aimed at Washington, I guess. So if they didn't destroy all the files somewhere, maybe out in St. Louis, it could be copies of these old historical reports, but I imagine there'd be no reason for them to save them all these years. That's
So what year were you discharged from the service?
1945 in Uniontown Gap, but I promptly, even before I left the base, volunteered to be in the Army Air Corps Reserve, and I stayed in the Air Corps Reserve until about 1947 when a separate U.S. Air Force was organized, and I got into that, and along came the Korean War, and I was recalled in 1951 for a year and a half, and I was shipped down to MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, near Tampa, and then later I was shipped up to Turner Air Force Base in Georgia, and then my year and a half was about up, and the commanding officer of that little outfit, and this is again with the Strategic Air Command, Radar Bomb Scoring Squadron it was, and the captain says, "Kuhn, we like you." He says, "If you volunteer to sign up for another hitch in the service, we'll recommend you for another stripe," which would have made me a staff sergeant. And I says, "Well, I'm honored, but I've already become a school teacher before the Korean War came along, and they need school teachers up there, and stenographers are a dime a dozen." So I bowed out and went back to my job in Hershey as a school teacher. And then promptly, when I got back to Hershey, the superintendent says, "Paul Kuhn," it says, "our senior high special ed teacher decided to move on up to Harrisburg, and he says he's resigning at the end of the year, and if you're interested, you may apply for the job." I was interested, and I got the job and stayed in that same position until I retired in 1979.
Yeah, we kind of missed, I think, when you went to college.
Shippensburg,
And what year was that?
1946,
So that's when you came out of the service.
and I worked in Gettysburg at a rubber factory until September came along, and then I went to Shippensburg under the GI Bill, and I did 4 years work in about 3.5 years, because along about August of 1949 I had finished my bachelor's degree, everything that I needed, and I got a degree, my bachelor's degree.
And what brought you to Hershey then?
When I was finishing the year, long about December of 1948, I was rooming upstairs in the home of a school teacher, a Shippensburg school teacher, and her brother or relatives were on the school board there in the area, and they learned that there was a lady out in this little country school near Shippensburg who couldn't finish the year. She was giving up her job at Christmas, during the Christmas vacation. I learned about this. I checked with my laboratory teacher's director, and I says I'd be interested in doing my practice teaching on the job in this one-room country school. I got the job, and as I was teaching near the end of that year, it would be maybe April or May in 1949, two gentlemen came into my school one day, and I said, "Gentlemen," I says, "it's just shortly time for the youngsters to have their 15-minute break, recess we called it," and I says, "Then I'll talk with you." So anyway, at break time, and the kids went out to play, they told me that they were the superintendent of school from Hershey and the elementary principal. A. Sterling King was the principal, and Raymond Cook was their superintendent. And they told me that they had heard about me from Dr. Sponseller, the director of the laboratory teacher training school, and that he told them what I was doing and that I was an ex-serviceman, and they said it sounded good to us, so we decided we'd come and see you. They said we've got a job waiting for somebody in Hershey to work with remedial reading and slow learners, not special ed, but just remedial reading and slow learners in the 5th and 6th grades. And I came to Hershey for an interview, and I got the job, and I stayed there until the Korean War came along. And after the Korean War, as I mentioned, I was down in MacDill Air Force Base and Turner Air Force Base. When I came back, the opening for senior high special ed was available, and I got the job and stayed there until I retired in 1979, after 30 and a half years of teaching.
So had not the special ed opening come open, you really had no interest in following up in special ed. You might have found yourself taking a different path.
Yes, I was always good in composition, writing, and I was interested in poetry, and as you know, I've been writing poems since I've known you, and I gave each of our kids a collection of poems, 100 or so. But I would have enjoyed crafts work, shop work, industrial arts, that sort of thing, because I had a background in that, both at Biggerville High School and later on I went to Millersville for several courses. One of the finest industrial arts teacher I've ever known worked there at Millersville College. So crafts, teaching of reading and this sort of thing. And I may have mentioned that I'm now involved in Monday afternoons for 3 hours going to Harrisburg Area Community College and working under the literacy program developed by Frank Charles Lobach. And he has been working in over 100 countries helping illiterate people who didn't know how to read, to learn how to read. And this I'm interested in, not for the monetary thing, it's a volunteer sort of thing. People in need, perhaps in the slums of Harrisburg or whatever, where there might be people who never learned to read. And a one-on-one situation, they tell me that's the most ideal situation. I find somebody maybe in Harrisburg who never learned to read for whatever reason, and it can be any age. It can be a grandmother or an old man or whoever. So that's one of my interests right now.
Well, you came back to Hershey and you got a job as a teacher, and there was opportunity there in the special education field. You also, I think you met somebody special in your life.
You're talking about your mother-in-law, Mary Ann. Yes. Billy Hershey knew me almost immediately when I started teaching, because he was a special ed student. He was born crippled with cerebral palsy. And I hadn't really met his sister, but he used to tell me, he says, "You got to meet my sister." He says, "You'll like her." And it just so happened that Mary Ann was working in the cafeteria in the basement of the community building in Hershey, and I happened to be living up on the 3rd or 4th floor in that same building. So I ate some of my meals there, I think.
Now, was there a cafeteria in the community building, or was it in the Cocoa Inn?
No, community building, in the basement.
The community building?
In the basement.
Really?
Yep.
I never knew that.
And that's where I met Mary Ann. That's right across from the chocolate factory, down in the basement.
Sure.
And that's where I met Mary Ann. And before I started dating her, before I really got to know her, I knew that her job was to clear off the tables when people were through eating. And I used to, when I was through eating, I would stack up my dishes as high as I could, make them in a pyramid, and then I'd go off somewhere else and sit down and watch her untangle this mess of pottery when she'd come by. And she told me later, says, "I'm so mad at you for doing that." But anyway, that's when I got to meet her, and that's how I got to meet her. But Billy was constantly telling me about his big sister. But it was in December, I think, that I had my first date with Mary Ann. And this was I was in, I was during a vacation, I guess it was, and I had arranged with Mary Ann to have our first date, and for some reason I had gone back to Shippensburg. I had a lot of friends there, and on the day of the date, one of my friends there in Shippensburg, whom I had met going to college, wanted to borrow my car, and I says, there's a slight conflict. I says, I have a date in Hershey with this Mary Ann Hershey, and I says, I'll lend you my car provided you tell her as soon as you get there that we'll postpone our date until later because you wanted to borrow my car. He forgot all about it. And Mary Ann was stewing. She had gone out and bought a new dress and some other things, and she told me later, says, I was so mad at you, boy, I could hit you with a club. But anyway, she learned later that it was an innocent thing that the guy forgot, and I had made arrangements for him to tell her as soon as he got to Hershey that we would have our date later. But that was sort of a humorous situation, but that's how Mary Ann and I got to know each other. I stood her up on a date. It was funny. It was funny.
But we all know later on you did propose.
Oh yes, 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 yes. And that's in summer of 1950. I went back to State College. Of course, I had a couple vehicles then. And I had a 49 Ford, which I had bought. It was a demonstrator from Francis Ford in Harrisburg. So I let Mary Ann borrow my 49 Ford for the summer while I was going to Penn State, and she said near the end of the school year, says, now, are you serious at all about me? I says, what do you mean? She says, well, you're going to Penn State for the summer. Do you want us to keep our relationship? And I said, what do you mean? She says, well, what about a ring? And I, oh my goodness, an engagement ring. So I went to Irwin's jewelry store there on West Chocolate Avenue, across from the Methodist Church, and I splurged $125, I think it was, and bought an engagement ring and gave it to Mary Ann. So that attached her and me. And then later I bought a wedding ring, which cost me, I think, $95. But anyway, in 1950, we were married. She was still a teenager, 12 days away from her 20th birthday, and I used to enjoy telling people, I married a teenager, and she would answer right back, well, I was almost 20. I said, yes, but you were still a teenager. We were married on the 19th of August, 1950, and she would have been 20 on the very end of August, the 31st, which happened to be my mother's birthday. But my mother had already died, and Mary Ann had never met my mother. Rather interesting. Mary Ann was born on my mother's birthday. So
Besides the obvious things that might come to mind, what are some of the things that you and Mary Ann enjoyed doing together before the children came along?
Well, we would go to the movies. I remember one time, this is a funny thing. We were on our way home from Hershey, back to her home, and it was a nice full moon, and I said, oh boy, it's full at night, and she says, you mean the gas tank? That was a funny response, and I've never forgotten that. I was talking about the beautiful moon. The moon was full, and she thought I was talking about the gas tank, because it used to be tradition for the fellows that wanted to have extra time with their dates to supposedly run out of gas, and that would give them parking time out in the country somewhere. But anyway, that was a humorous thing I can recall. That was her comment. When I said it's full tonight, the gas tank? I think it was down there in Cocoa Avenue where she made that comment. Anyway, those are funny little sidelights.
What were your plans back then?
Uh,
What did you talk, what were you thinking back then? It was a long time ago, but what did you see in the future? I mean, some people, they might see themselves becoming president of the United States or a congressman, or some people see themselves being successful in some business venture. When you're young and you're full of all that pep and vigor, and you think you can go out and conquer the world, and there you are hand in hand. Did you have any aspirations back then you can remember?
I just wanted to be a good school teacher. I remained in the Army Air Force Reserves, and I remember, I think I used to go down to Reading for a limited training, and then eventually I got involved with a reserve outfit in Dover, Delaware, and I would go down there once a month, I think one weekend a month, and I still was a stenographer, and they liked me, and I enjoyed that. That was a good experience. But to be a good teacher, be a good reservist, those were things that I enjoyed.
So when you set up housekeeping, did you live at the Hershey farm at first?
We lived for a short while upstairs in the old summer house, which we now own. And of course, there was an addition built onto the old summer house, which became our living room, and 2 rooms upstairs. And I guess right after we were married, we lived 2 places before we moved upstairs there. Aunt Ruth and Uncle Munro Clotfelder had owned the Hershey Tourist Court, and they wanted to go on vacation, I believe, one time about the time we were married. So we ran the tourist court for, I guess, a week, and that was a nice experience. And then we rented the back of the old schoolhouse up on the hill near where the police academy now is. Owl Hill, they called it, Owl Hill. Back of the school building. And of course, the lady lived in the front, and we rented the back. And I remember we had the electrician come in and hook up a 220, I guess, for electric stove, and that was our contribution in beyond paying rent. We didn't ask the lady to pay us for that. We had an electric stove, and we wanted to have the place wired so we could use our stove. And then we went for a while with Verna Hershey's summer house for a short while, and then eventually we bought the place in Palmyra, a little place on South Hetrick, where we had the bicycle business, and you knew about that. And then Harvey Hershey died in '62, I guess, and my mother-in-law, Verna Hershey, says we'd like one of the children to move home, and we'll help them build an addition onto the old summer house for their own home. And we were the ones that, I guess, were most available. And I think we spent about $18,000 for Sherwood Kiefer to come and build an addition onto the old summer house, which is our full basement, our big living room, which is almost the size of this room, and 2 rooms upstairs. And then we eventually, after 20 years of owning the bicycle shop and a little house there in South Hendrick Avenue, we moved to Hershey in '63, I guess, and that's where we've stayed ever since. It's been a very lovely experience. Verna May Klopfelder Hershey was a wonderful mother-in-law. I hope your mother-in-law will turn out to be as revered and as I esteemed Verna Hershey, my mother-in-law. She was a marvelous woman. Harvey Hershey was a wonderful father-in-law. I had mentioned before, he had never let a hungry man, a bum, go by who was hungry and stop for food. He had never refused to give him something to eat, and if it was near bedtime, he would allow the bum to sleep out in the barn, provided he would turn in his cigarettes and matches, because he didn't want a fellow to be smoking and burn down his barn. But living there has been a marvelous, marvelous experience. Mary Ann, last couple of years, has said, as we get older and older, maybe we won't be able to walk up these steps to go upstairs to bed. Maybe we ought to buy a house with a ranch house, all on one floor. I said, Mary Ann, I said, I like this place. I'm satisfied to stay here as long as I live. I said, if needs be, we can build an additional bedroom onto the back of the house, and then you won't need to walk upstairs to bed. Anyway, that's some of our thinking. And I enjoy living where we are, and I enjoy my sons-in-laws, one daughter-in-law. We have one daughter-in-law. I tell Phyllis, White's wife, that she's the best daughter-in-law we ever had. And of course, each one of our kids is different. Elizabeth is teaching the Bible class. Your wife Paula has the dog grooming parlor. Dwight's in a technical section of Hershey Foods. Julie, out in Akron, Ohio, has become a CPA. And Verna is a lover of horses since she was a kid, and she's still working with the horses out at Penn National. We have Verna's youngest daughter, whom we adopted. We raised her since she was a baby. She's now 24 years old, and over in Qatar, a peninsula sticking out into the Indian Ocean or the Persian Gulf from Saudi Arabia. She's in the explosive ordnance disposal unit to clear landmines and bombs in war areas. I hope she does her job safely. They even have a robot that in an extremely dangerous place, they can put a robot out there and let it, rather than have a person be killed, a robot can be detonated by the landmine. Anyway, I just read in the news yesterday, today, that we accidentally dropped, one of our jet planes dropped bombs on some Canadian forces over there and killed 4 men, I guess, 4 Canadians, and injured a number of others. It was an error. They're trying to figure out what caused the mistake. But anyway, Daniel, my big challenge to you and anybody that I talk with about, how can we end that situation in Afghanistan and the terrorism anywhere in the world? How can mankind learn to live at peace with his fellow man? That's my challenge to other thinking people. Hopefully God will give us some answers. Maybe we'll always have wars, but let's have less of them. And let's have battles of ideas rather than battles of bombs and bullets. So there's my speech.
Over the years, naturally raising 5 children and 1 grandchild, what did you find the most rewarding about having these children? You personally, what was your favorite thing about being a father?
Oh, going down the line. I was proud of Elizabeth for becoming a school teacher. I was proud of your wife for having been the concert mistress in high school and then eventually joining the Central Pennsylvania Symphony. And I enjoy once or several times a year going to hear her play in the symphony. I am thrilled with her dog grooming business. Dwight with a technical center, Julie being a CPA, and Verna with her horses. The Lord has blessed us with all these things. I have no serious problems with any of our son-in-laws or our one daughter-in-law. The Lord has been wonderful. In many families there's a lot of unwanted strife. I can't see it in our family. We don't always agree with everybody. Even Mary Ann and I don't always agree, but we've managed almost 52 years together, and I think that's quite an achievement.
But as a father, as the kids were growing up, and you interfaced as a father,